Thanks, gentlemen, for doing this with us. You know, as Margaret says, we have thought about this a lot, particularly since December when we began this conversation. We were waiting for the FDA guidelines, and now here we are. We actually have them in hand. And I guess maybe, David, if you would start out, maybe you are the right person to start sort of running through the naming issues, the interchangeability, sort of what came out in these guidelines and maybe how that changes the landscape.
Sure, and thank you. I'm delighted to be here. At the end of the year and in the run-up to the change in administration, there was a real push by FDA to publish some of the long-awaited guidances. Two of them of note. One is the interchangeability guidance, finally publicizing for the industry FDA's expectations regarding demonstrations of interchangeability for biosimilars in comparison to the reference product, and we'll talk about that some more. Of note, though, that was issued as a draft, and the comment period as of yesterday was extended, so it's still an evolving document. In addition, the agency issued final guidance on the naming of biosimilars and their related reference product. And the issue there is there's, as we know, the brand name, the name that the product is sold under, and then the more boring non-proprietary or established name.
The hyphen name.
Correct. And so FDA held firm that the non-proprietary name should have a suffix at the end that will distinguish it from every other manufacturer.
Distinguish it, but not distinguish it too much.
Correct.
Right? I mean,
correct.
Distinguish it, but with a suffix that is not related to the actual name.
So not my term, but someone else's term, a nonsensical suffix. so we have like DYYB as a suffix. So there's a whole sort. There was a lot of debate about that. I think we have unanimity across the industry, biosimilar and the research-based industry. Nobody likes it.
Okay.
But the idea is that you should be able to trace back to the original manufacturer, the source, right. And the only way to do that is to associate each product with a specific add-on.
But without whatever biasing physicians, I guess, in terms of what they provide to their patients. Can you explain this? Why this is relevant to the manufacturers? What suffix gets used? I mean, really, the nonsensical part is hard to understand. But why is that actually a benefit?
Well, I also appreciate being involved in the panel here. Well, I think the main thing is we want to try to have naming that is recognizable by the community. With having that suffix there, it does cause possible, more confusion in the marketplace on credibility from the physician side. Naming is not part of the INN in Europe, so we still advocate that we don't think a suffix is needed, but it's there for pharmacovigilance that other people thought would be important for tracking of the biologics.
So some sort of suffix, but not necessarily a suffix that identifies you with Pfizer or Sandoz or whatever. I want to just put a number on the end of it. Why does it have to be letters to begin with? I don't know. Dr. Lin, talk to us about what this means in terms of patient care and as you advise membership.
Well, number one, the American Cancer Society doesn't have a position on the naming. The only position that we have is my position. That is, I can't even pronounce the real name, let alone the suffix name. So if you ever try, for those of you who have ever interviewed me, ipilimumab, whatever, still makes me a twist on my tongue. So I'm having trouble with that. However, as we're sitting here having this discussion, one of the key issues for us on behalf of the patient community, and I speak both from the society, but also as a physician who's been involved in oncology and involved in some of these discussions along the way, that naming convention is important for exactly the reason that's pointed out. The traceability is important. Understanding, and we may get to that during our conversation, understanding where that drug came from, who made it, and the fact that it's a substitution or whatever we wish to call it. My terms of art may not be exact, I apologize. But having said that, that traceability understanding is important. And therefore, whatever the FDA and the industry decides, that's their business. But being able to find out where the drug came from is everyone's concern.
whether it's a nonsensical suffix or not. Interchangeability. We've already heard some of the concerns about that, but interchangeability and where these guidelines take us. Do these guidelines improve the situation for us?
Well, the guidelines provide clarity. I think they're relatively conservative on the part of the agency. FDA wants to be very careful. They don't want there to be a mistake, a tragedy, and to result in a setback to the program. What's interesting about the guidelines, first of all, what they do is they set up the concept of a simulated switching study. So in essence, you're not really studying the biosimilar, you're studying the concept of whether patients can be switched for this particular protein. So remember, with biologics, which are different from what we call small molecule drugs, the immune system recognizes the product and it instantly adapts to the product. And so the question with interchangeability is whether a patient whose immune system is already adapted to one manufacturer's version of the protein, whether that patient's immune system will react differently when they're pinged, and when the immune system essentially is pinged by a different manufacturer's version. So it's the concept of switching that FDA is really cautious about. And if the patient develops antibodies that are suppressing the effect of that protein, even the efficacy, the effectiveness of the biosimilar, and even the reference product could be affected. So it's both a safety and an effectiveness issue. So what FDA did is they, in pretty fine detail, outlined how you design one of these studies. So now it's out there, there's clarity. FDA also specified that those studies can only be done with US reference product. So another conservative and perhaps limiting principle.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. I mean, what is the limitation to the manufacturer?
I mean, there's issues, with that from, as mentioned, U.S.-only manufactured product. So partly one is getting that product, the cost of getting that product versus getting the product in other parts of the world. So there are things, part of the interchangeability guidelines, that we do like, that the FDA finally providing guidance is fabulous. And they've taken a stepwise approach to the approval the same way they have in looking at the biosimilar. So there's aspects of it that is excellent, but there's still a lot of questions regarding how do you do the switching.
And does it actually extend the process? I mean, what's been talked about from the administration has always been streamline. We need to get this. Doesn't this actually take the process longer?
Right. It's a higher burden of proof that we have to prove. So that's increased cost to do more studies. So it's an add-on process.
I don't suppose any patient is going to say, well, we want you to speed up in any way damage efficacy or safety questions. But does this create complications that you view as unnecessary to moving the product forward?
It's really, the confidence partly, this is the only, place in the world that's looking at interchangeability. All right, and sometimes you even have to take a look at site of care, as mentioned earlier, there's already, health systems with formularies making decisions. All right, plus also the type of care. You have acute care, maybe cancer, where it's such a shorter term, interchangeability may not even be an issue, as I've seen in some studies, where on inflammation, where it's chronic care, is where the bigger opportunity is available.
Dr. Lin?
It's an interesting issue because, the gray hair shows that I've been around for a while. And we had similar discussions about generics when I won't tell you how long ago it was. It was a long time ago in medical school, whether they were the same or not. And today, about 85% of the medications are generics. The issue of interchangeability versus, biosimilars versus whatever is, I can, again, share, speaking as a physician who's been involved in discussions on a state legislative basis. This is an issue of considerable concern that David has already outlined in terms of whether there are going to be difficulties as these go back and forth from product to product, place to place. Maybe somebody gets treated in one place, goes to another place, maybe their carrier changes, maybe the formulary changes, and so this is top of mind. The question will be, and again, I'm not a regulator and I'm not somebody who studies that industry, but going forward creating the confidence on the interchangeability that in fact it works. Because ultimately, when you go to the pharmacy today and you get a prescription for a medication and the pharmacist gives you the generic, you don't even think twice about it. And pretty much your physician doesn't, or your healthcare professional, not provider, professional doesn't think about it. But we have to get to that point, and we're not there yet. So if we can move that forward, and ultimately, talking about that naming convention, it's not just what you show in the clinical trial, not what you show in leading up to the approval, it's what happens afterwards. As the post-marketing surveillance becomes even more important when it comes to these products to build that confidence over time. Hopefully we won't see a problem, but because of the biologic nature of these medications, we can't be certain.
Yeah. And the complexity of developing formulas when you don't see, because of the patent dance, you don't see the other side. You don't see what the biologic formulation was to begin with.
Well, that's right. So one of the challenges for the biosimilar is it has to go out and acquire on the market reference product. It has to go out and get the research-based branded product and create a target just by characterizing that product, and then show FDA that it can hit that target. Show it through very sophisticated analytics, and then through a clinical study.
I want to talk about Europe and the model that it provides for us in the United States. It is quite different, and this has led to quite a few more products being released to market. Can you talk about that and what it does to limit our process, and maybe whether somebody like Dr. Burgess should be taking into consideration what Germany has done?
Well, you're right. Europe has been about a decade ahead of the United States in terms of opening the market to biosimilars. Now, commercially, the products have not been that successful until recently in Europe. But the Europeans opened their market much earlier than the United States. The United States took a much more conservative view. There was a sort of very important incident in Europe involving an alternative version of Epogen, erythropoietin alpha, that resulted in a lot of adverse events. And so FDA took that into consideration, Congress took that into consideration, and took a much slower pathway. Now, one of the longer-term issues with Europe and the United States is the opportunity to develop one set of clinical data that will satisfy both regulators. And that's the important part where FDA has been very supportive of allowing sponsors to use non-US versions of the product to develop the biosimilar, not to make the interchangeability demonstration, but to get on the market as a biosimilar. So we're seeing a sort of harmonized data sets, harmonized dossiers. It's not quite there yet. The FDA always likes to put its own imprint on a sponsor's application.
Well, particularly we're about to have a new commissioner.
Yep.
And so what is your expectation on that?
I think the expectation is, trying to get the products to market quicker and earlier. And, so anything that has, burdens to try to slow down adoption, understanding, education, we hope the administration pushes forward in terms of making products being more accessible. So I think just from all their guidelines from reimbursement or other areas, trying to make it as easy as possible needs to be a true goal of the administration.
Yeah. Reimbursement, also a big dinging point, right? How do you identify, how do you code, what happens here? What is I'm not really sure which of you should take that on, but where does the Hill need to be thinking about that?
I think they're looking at me because they don't want to talk about this, and I'm not sure I do either, okay?
Oh, come on.
Well, we can have a whole discussion just about the reimbursement and the cost of these drugs. Clearly, from our perspective, from the American Cancer Society perspective, our desire is that these drugs be as accessible as possible to as wide a population as possible at the most reasonable price possible. I'm not going to get into the discussion here today about are these too expensive, are they not expensive? I mean, these are, from the cancer side, I said these are, I would say, they're interesting markets. They're not quite as robust, perhaps, as they are for some of the other drugs that are moving forward in the biosimilar environment. We're moving to an era where they get much more focus, a very small percentage of patients. But ultimately, we do want to see those costs brought down and the mechanisms employed to do that. So having biosimilars is important. Having said that, we also realize, at least what we've been told and what we believe is going to happen, is that the entrance of biosimilars into this marketplace is not going to be a falling off the cliff price event as it has been for the small molecule drugs we've talked about before. Now, you can look at reimbursement from the physician side. That's, again, a whole different question, because you have to remember that many of these drugs are given in physicians' offices. They're covered under Medicare Part B, for example. They're infusions. They are not part of the pharmacy benefit. That raises all sorts of other questions. Those are large amounts of money. So they would probably benefit from some reduction in price as well in terms of tying up funds that are
I mean, one of the things that has made generics palatable for the lay population is this notion that, hey, you're going to get these much cheaper. But can you, particularly if we talk about regulation that extends the process to approval, can you promise me that I'm going to see those kinds of reductions in cost?
Well, you're seeing savings that you've seen, you know what happens in Europe and, the two current products on the market. To see those savings that you see in the generic world, that is not going to happen because the cost to manufacture these products, it's almost $100 to $200 million to develop it. Then the cost to educate and the cost to, to take a look at, the different marketplace, look at the patients, the physicians, the pharmacists, the education side of understanding biosimilars, there's a lot to that. And, as Dr. Len said, the Medicare Part B, there is a mechanism on reimbursement as an ASP price, and the administration has at least, they have reimbursing the biosimilar at its ASP, but the 6% of the reference product or the brand product. So they've tried to put together the reimbursement to not to disadvantage. But there are some things like under the donut hole, biosimilars are disadvantaged right now because there's a loophole. So there's some corrections that we feel need to be made just to make sure that biosimilars are made available for patients.
Yeah, my take on this is, competition will change pricing over time. Competition will be more limited than it is in the small molecule area. But it's always important to remember the law that Congress passed is a Price, Competition, and Innovation Act. And so there's both competition, but there's also that competition will hopefully spur further innovation. So where ultimately the market lands will depend upon, how durable the biosimilars are in the marketplace, and whether there's now more of a motivation on the part of the research-based industry to keep innovating and keep ahead, which is a good thing for patients, but not always a good thing for the economics.
Oh, it's certainly a challenge for the companies.
Joie, if I may, I'm going to come back to you. If I don't, but you mentioned about reimbursement at the reference product price.
No, it's reimbursed at the ASP of the biosimilar, but the 6% add-on is at the references.
So we're getting into the weeds a little bit for the folks who are here in the audience who may not have lived in Medicare reimbursement, and I have the misfortune of having done that for a good portion of my career. ASP is the average sales price that's determined based on information provided by what the manufacturer sells it to the wholesaler. And that would obviously be a substantial difference in the price. And then the 6% is the add-on minus the budget adjustment that the physicians get paid for prescribing the drug. My concern when you said that was that it was being reimbursed at the reference product price, because that would then create an incentive to use the biosimilar, because then that extra money goes in the pocket of the person who would prescribe it and administer the drug.
All right. Any questions from our audience? We wanted to solicit any ideas that you had on this.
Can I make one comment while they're coming up here? Another comment. I want to just mention something about FDA, because the audience is varied here, and I'm aware of that. But I think it's important that this whole conversation about the FDA and approval and the speed of approval depends on where you sit. And I have to say the oncology community, for the most part, has been very pleased with what the FDA has done. We do think, and Dr. Pazner and his colleagues particularly, and the former Commissioner Califf, who made an effort on this, really did try to bring drugs through the process more efficiently. So we know that's an issue here in Washington, but from a larger perspective, we're not terribly displeased with what we have seen in the oncology community, with the willingness of the FDA to move forward, having conversations with their colleagues internationally, taking that information into consideration, perhaps informal conversations, but nonetheless, I do think that's a point that I would like to make to the audience.
Over that last administration,
Yes.
but now.
Hopefully that will continue.
Okay, question.
So I'm Phil Fan from Johns Hopkins. I'll be very interested to hear from you where you think or what you think the pipeline is right now, because obviously, you know, what ends up getting marketed is very much dependent on what's coming into the pipeline, and given sort of recent barriers to approvals, has this been sort of discouraging investment, and do you see investment going up or going down?
I think that's you.
We'll hear from. As I understand, the pipeline is quite rich at FDA. There's 40 to 50 applications in development. The focus has primarily been on the chronic use space. So the rheumatoid arthritis biologics is a very robust pipeline. The sort of more acute care oncology products probably much less so. You're in the pipeline.
Yeah, well, no, I think there's 60 plus, what I've heard, products that are at the FDA under consideration, or that's in the process. All right, so I think there is investment that the biosimilar manufacturer community is investing in trying to bring these products to market. 2 are approved right now. The other 2 that are approved are held up in litigation. So you do have the legal side litigation that's making its way through, and I'm happy to say that the Supreme Court now is going to view and decide upon really the patent dance and the 180-day exclusivity that a brand company still gets after approval, where there's more clarity through then at least the approval process. So things are happening. They just take their time through the legal side and through the legislative side.
Yeah, but the courts to get into the courts to get into formulations and so forth.
Well, a little bit of perspective. So in 1984, we had the Hatch-Waxman Act that unleashed the generic drug industry, and it took 10 years for FDA to finalize the regulations. And it wasn't until the late 1990s, 15 years later, that really the core litigation was settled. And there were some early Supreme Court cases as well. So it's not unexpected in an industry as contentious and complex as this that we're going to see that. But actually, I think some of the key disputes about the intersection between the science and intellectual property have actually risen through the courts quite quickly. And this term, in fact, in early April, we'll have a Supreme Court oral argument on the 2 major gating issues. So it does seem slow, it seems glacial, but by lawyer standards and FDA standards, it's actually moving apace.
Other thoughts in the audience? When we think about, I keep coming back to thinking about Germany and how they view efficacy and how that has maybe created a different process for them than what we're looking at in the United States. Can you reflect on whether that is a model for something we should be considering, something Hill should be considering here?
So what little I know about the differences are this. In the European side and the German side, the regulators have gone ahead and issued guidance to the industry first on their expectations, and then allowed the industry to follow. FDA and Congress together made the decision that they would rather work with individual sponsors rather than issue class-wide guidance. And so it's the U.S. picked, I would say, a much more resource-intensive approach where they negotiate individually behind closed doors with individual manufacturers on the scientific database that would be needed on a product-specific basis. Whereas Europe instead issued kind of class-wide guidance that the industry could follow. And I think in the U.S. it may have been a little short-sighted. I think the U.S. they were worried about the reference sponsors, the research-based pharmaceutical industry, getting too involved with the biosimilar programs, and so they tried to shield that. But we might look back and say that consumes too many resources and is too slow.
Is it the factor that slows down the process? I mean, this is the thing that the administration would like to see, the process to move faster, not only in biosimilars, but across the pharmaceutical space.
Well, as Chip mentioned, we support the funding to try to get approvals quicker, and we hope that the process will be streamlined. I know the administration has had a increased approval rate of generics, and of now we want to see more biosimilars coming in the future. So what I like about the biosimilar process is they put a stepwise approach to work with the manufacturers to make sure you're getting it right through the process, which has been beneficial. Now, that may take a longer time, but it's make sure let's get it right. Because the last thing, the government, everybody wants is that they want to make sure it is correct, everything is safe, effective, it's fingerprint-like similarity that has allowed the biosimilar to come to market.
As we wrap up this session, I want to talk about the intersection, Dr. Len, between the physician and the patients when it comes to biosimilars. As we were talking about earlier from the beginning of this program, we talked about this is set to become really an explosive part of the market. Within just the next 5 years, we could be looking at triple the sales of this product, so these biosimilar products. When you think about talking to patients, what is the education that we need to understand about this?
Well, I think a lot of that education is going to fall to health professionals and getting their confidence. And as I listen to the conversation, I think we're talking a lot about today, but understand that about what's happening right now. We need to reflect on what's going to be happening in the future. And you mentioned this is going to be explosive. It will be explosive. It won't be explosive today or tomorrow, but certainly 5, 10, and 15 years from now, it's going to be very explosive because many of the new drugs coming to market are, in fact, biologics. So this work is important. But it's also going to be important to maintain awareness, oversight, post-marketing surveillance, to make sure that, in fact, if there's a problem, that we know there's a problem. We need to have that because what we're going to be seeing in that 10 or 15, 20 years, which seems a long way away, but it's not that far away in this business, is going to be built on the confidence we established today. So making sure of adequate funding for the FDA, the manufacturing processes are monitored, that people have the confidence that they're given that information over time is going to be a very important part of the structure as we make this transition. Get the confidence of health professionals and get the confidence of patients that they can rely that this, in fact, is something that is fundamentally the same. Drug A is fundamentally the same as drug B. We have to rely on the FDA and the industry to make that happen, but we need to make sure that oversight is in place.
Very important to all of us. Thank you all, gentlemen, very much for being with us today.